Go into the world and tell every man that you meet, there is a man on the cross.
A Catholic Take. What you need to know right now. A bold synthesis of inspiration and information. Keeping you up to date on the news and issues from a courageous Catholic perspective.
A Catholic Take with Joe McLean starts now.
Praise be to Jesus Christ. Welcome back to A Catholic Take, a bold synthesis of information and inspiration. I'm your host, Joe McLean. So good to be on with you. Praise be to God. It's going to be a great show today. We're going to have two incredible guests. Guest number one, Dr. Thomas Williams, has a book called The Coming Crisis, out with Sophia Institute Press. We're going to have a conversation about the current crisis of martyrdom happening. In fact, there's a story today in the news. A priest killed in Nigeria. I'll be sharing that with you this hour. But things are pretty bad in some parts of the world. But what about the rest of the world? What can we expect? And how does this compare to times gone by, say the 1st and 2nd century? Are things heating up? Well, Dr. Thomas Williams is going to conversate about that in the 15 past guest segment. Do join us for that if you can. At 30 past the hour, though, we're going to have a conversation with Father Robert Nixon. He is a co-host of a podcast published by Tan Books called the Spiritual Masters Podcast. We're going to be talking about the Imitation of Christ. Have you read the Imitation of Christ? Not only have I read it, I was paid to narrate it into audio book form some 12 years ago or so. I don't recommend my version of it, by the way. It was the most painful thing that I think I've ever done in my life. It was so difficult to get through. And I've been through Marine Corps boot camp, so let that sink in. So we're going to have a conversation about the Imitation of Christ and Thomas Kempis at 30 past the hour. Lots of stories, of course, to share with you. We'll be linking to everything we talk about in the show notes over at thestationofthecross.com/ACT. Let's pray. Let's begin. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Remember, O most gracious Virgin Mary, that never was it known that anyone who fled to thy protection, implored thy help, or sought thine intercession was left unaided. Inspired by this confidence, I fly unto thee, O Virgin of Virgins, my mother. To thee do I come, before thee I stand sinful and sorrowful, O Mother of the Word incarnate. Despise not my petitions, but in thy mercy hear and answer me. Amen. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. And now your saint of the day.
Saint Anthony of Padua, pray for us. Anthony was born with the name Ferdinand in 1195 to a noble family in Lisbon, Portugal. At a young age, he entered the Augustinian order and was soon ordained a priest. But 10 years later, he left the Augustinians to become a Franciscan, originally hoping to die a martyr's death by preaching to the Saracens. He took the name Anthony in honor of the great St. Anthony the Abbot, patron of the chapel in which the later Anthony received his Franciscan habit. Anthony eventually ended up in Italy, where he maintained a quiet and humble demeanor despite his deep theological education. At one point, however, he was prevailed upon to preach, and stunned the congregation and his fellow friars with his erudition. From there on, he gained renown as a preacher, particularly against the heresies of his day. He also worked many miracles, including the purification of poisoned food by a simple sign of the cross, the example of a hungry donkey refusing oats and instead kneeling before the Blessed Sacrament in Anthony's hands to demonstrate the true presence, and the famous Sermon to the Fishes near Padua. On at least one occasion, he bilocated during a sermon in order to sing a lesson in a neighboring monastery. His success in defeating heresy and converting souls earned him the nickname the Hammer of Heretics. His accomplishments are all the more impressive for the fact that he died at just 36 years of age on June 13, 1231. Children ran through the streets crying out, "The saint is dead," and Anthony was indeed canonized the very next year by Pope Gregory IX. At the exhumation of the body about 30 years later, St. Bonaventure found St. Anthony's tongue perfectly preserved, as if still ready to preach another mighty sermon. The patronages of this beloved saint are far too many to list today. St. Anthony of Padua, pray for us.
And now your headline news. The Daily Wire reports Catholic Health Network Hospital receives millions for sex change surgery robot. A hospital affiliated with the largest Catholic health network in the country received millions of dollars for a robot that assists with transgender sex change operations, according to a new report from the Lepanto Institute. St. Francis Memorial Hospital, which is located in San Francisco, California, is part of the Dignity Health Network. In 2019, Dignity Health merged with Catholic Health Initiative to become Common Spirit Health, the largest Catholic health network in America. The network includes numerous hospitals, including St. Francis Memorial Hospital, that perform medical interventions that intend to change people's sex. The hospital even produced a YouTube video with a trans-identifying individual who underwent a sex change operation at St. Francis Memorial Hospital. The video promotes sex change surgeries as a way to, quote, live your authentic self, close quote. Yikes, talk about lies. Breitbart reports J.P. Morgan Chase settles with Jeffrey Epstein's alleged victims for $290 million. An unnamed victim known as Jane Doe 1 filed the class action lawsuit on behalf of more than 40 women. She claimed that for years the bank ignored red flags pointing to Epstein's sexual abuse of women and children. After servicing him for 15 years, the bank severed ties with Epstein back in 2013, 5 years after Epstein was convicted of procuring a child for prostitution. The bank said the settlement is not an admission of guilt. However, they do regret their association with Epstein. The bank also faces a lawsuit by the United States Virgin Islands alleging that the bank knew of the multimillionaire's illicit activity on the island. The trial is set for October 23rd. The National Post is reporting nuclear states modernize their weapons. Chinese arsenal is growing. The world's nuclear powers, and China in particular, increased investment in their arsenals for a third consecutive year in 2022 amid swelling geopolitical tensions, two reports showed Monday. The world's 9 nuclear-armed states jointly spent $82.9 billion on their arsenals last year, with the United States accounting for more than half of that, according to a new report from the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, or ICAN. As for China, the size of the country's nuclear arsenal has increased from 350 warheads in January 2022 to 410 in January 2023 and is expected to keep growing. And those are your headline news. The gospel today comes to us from Matthew chapter 5, verses 13 through 16. Jesus said to his disciples, "You are the salt of the earth. But if salt loses its taste, with what can it be seasoned? It is no longer good for anything but to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. You are the light of the world. A city set on a mountain cannot be hidden, nor do they light a lamp and then put it under a bushel basket. It is set on a lampstand where it gives light to all in the house. Just so, your light must shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your heavenly Father." The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ. Cornelius a Lapide, in his great commentaries, said this, "So too does a priest come to naught if he be too accommodating to people of the world. Let him remember that he ought to be salt and persevere in his vigor, gravity, and liberty in rebuking vices. Let him not be ashamed to profess openly that he is an ecclesiastic and a religious, that is, a worshiper of God, a spiritual person, a despiser of the world, a lover of heavenly things." Oof, Cornelius Lapide, he's so good. He goes on to say, "You ask, why does Christ call his apostles the salt of the earth rather than gold or silver or precious stones? I answer, because salt is a thing universally necessary and useful. Salt is, as it were, the balm of nature, which preserves and seasons almost all things with which it is mixed and keeps them from corruption. Thus the apostles were the salt, i.e. the balm of the earth. Salt denotes the office, power, and dignity of the apostles, for salt is the symbol of wisdom. For as salt seasons food and makes it savory, so does wisdom season the mind and make it wise. The apostles, therefore, were salt because they corrected the unsavory morals of the world and made them wise and savory." Think about that the next time the Catholic hospital, for instance, out in San Francisco, is it being corrected as as the Lord has anticipated he wants his apostles to do? What about the LA Dodgers for participating in the whole gay LGBTQ ideology with this hate group that hates Catholics and mocks them incessantly? Are they being corrected? Is the Archdiocese calling for a correction? Are they protesting them publicly, or they just want everybody to stay in their little pew and pray? Think about that in connection to this commentary. He goes on to say, salt excites thirst, so the apostles have excited a thirst for heavenly things. Here, St. Hilary says, quote, the apostles are the preachers of heavenly things, and, as it were, sowers of eternity. They bring immortality to all upon their speech is sprinkled, all upon whom their speech is sprinkled. Going on to say, ye have been chosen by me to cure all the putridity of the world. Ye are the salt of the earth, close quote. But if the salt have lost its savor, if an apostle, if a bishop, if a priest who ought, like salt, to season the morals of others, shall through gluttony, uncleanness, fear, or flattery lose the vigor of his spiritual salt, who shall restore it to him? No one. This may be seen in the case of some of the priests and pastors of the past age, who either led scandalous lives or else were ignorant and negligent in instructing the people who were wandering in or verging upon heresy. Whence the ecclesiastical order came into sad contempt, whence the heresies of Luther, Calvin, and the rest sprung up. Who say? Oh my heavens, so many bad things left to say here, but we'll have to pause there. At the end of the day, Cornelius Lapide is reminding all of us that we are to be salt and we are to correct this world in order to save souls. The charity here is in the effort to save souls. Let's never forget that. We'll be right back. Welcome back to A Catholic Take, a bold synthesis of information and inspiration. I'm your host, Joe McLean. So good to be on with you. Praise be to God. Coming up at 30 past the hour, we're going to have a conversation with Father Robert Nixon about the spiritual masters. There's a podcast out by TAN Publishing where they're talking about the spiritual works. And in particular, the one we're going to discuss is the Imitation of Christ. This is a work that I'm familiar with because I had to narrate it into audiobook form. And it was literally one of the most painful things I've ever done. It was so hard to get through. In many ways, I felt like this was a sledgehammer to the heart of a complacent age of religious. But was this meant for you and me? Is this meant for laity? Who wrote this? Who is Thomas à Kempis? What is his background? And what is this good for? Especially given the light that we often hear it's the second most sold spiritual work in the history of the world. Like, that blows my mind. We're talking Teresa of Avila, St. Augustine, John of the Cross. There's so many great works. And this is number 2. We're going to have that conversation with Father Robert Nixon at 30 past the hour. Do join us if you can. But there's a book over at Sophia Institute Press. It's called The Coming Christian Persecution. And it's written by Dr. Thomas Williams. And I think this is a great conversation to have. He joins us now, I think, via Rome on video. Good morning to you, Thomas Williams.
Good morning to you. Thank you very much, Joe, for having me on your show.
I appreciate you being here. Breitbart correspondent, and I guess you've written quite a bit for Notre Dame and others. Let's talk about the coming persecution. There's so many questions here that I want to get into, but let's start with the biggest offenders. Atheism, liberalism, Islam. These seem to be the biggest offenders when it comes to Christian persecution. Today, in fact, I'm going to be reading a news segment in the next news break about a young Nigerian priest who was just martyred last week. He hadn't even been a priest a year, and he was shot to death. Nigeria seems to be the hotbed for Christian persecution. Is that the first offender in the world? Is that the greatest amount of Christian persecution we see today?
Well, it is called the country where you're most likely to die for being a Christian. So by one by one measurement, that's certainly the worst place to be. Some consider North Korea to be worse in the sense that it's completely illegal to be a Christian. You cannot pray. You cannot own a Bible. You can be thrown in jail. You can be killed. You can't talk to someone else about Jesus Christ. So, I mean, the level of persecution driven by that very, very radically atheist government in North Korea is really something to be reckoned with as well. And there are many fewer Christians, obviously, in North Korea than there are in a place like Nigeria, which is like 49% Christian. And yet they suffer at the hands of these radical Islamists there.
I had a conversation, I think it was Friday, with David Ramos from ACI Prensa. Mexico had almost as many priests killed as Nigeria last year. That blows my mind, too. It seems like Mexico, the persecution of the church is increasing, and most people aren't paying attention to it. A corrupt government, the cartels that run many states there where the government almost has zero control. And they see the priest as the means by which to capture command and authority over the people. Kill the priest, who else stands a chance? So I see it growing there. Have you been seeing the headlines there for Mexico?
I have. It's appalling what we've been seeing. This has been going on for some years now. It just keeps getting worse and worse. And as you say, it's kind of the perfect storm against Catholics and against Catholic priests in particular, because you have a very corrupt government, one that's turning a blind eye to a lot of this. And at the same time, the cartels are stronger now than they've ever been in Mexico. Obviously, the people, by and large, are with the church. It's still a very, very Catholic nation and a believing nation. But you're right. I mean, you kill the leaders, you chop off the head, and it's much easier than to have access at the sheep.
One of my favorite early church fathers is Ignatius of Antioch, and he writes his 7 letters to the churches of Asia Minor on his way to being eaten by lions in Rome. It's so epic, it's so epic. But nonetheless, he really is dealing with the Docetist heresy, and they looked Catholic. They had the smells, the bells, they had the vestments, they had liturgies. The one thing they didn't have was the resolve to die as Christian martyrs. They had no issue with offering incense to Caesar or anybody else. And he was really hammering that in his letters. The first to use the word Catholic to describe the church in his letter to the Samaritans. And yet I see similarities today to that time. The church in China, for instance, wants everyone you can have your religion so long as it's completely sanitized and devoid of its morals and theology, so long as it follows the state and our way of thinking, and you offer that pinch of incense to the communist god, so to speak. Do you see it that way too? And if so, then how can we justify supporting sort of the above ground state official church that is offering that pinch of incense?
And that is a fantastic analogy, Joe. That's exactly what's going on. And I'm honestly really distraught at the fact that we have now allowed priests and lay people to join the Catholic Patriotic Association, which is completely run by the Communist Party and is not faithful to Rome. And we've really kind of thrown under the bus those 6-7 million, we don't have an exact number, of underground Catholics who have held strong despite great persecution, great suffering. They have been unwilling to budge because of their loyalty to Rome and to the Pope. And we really have abandoned them in a very serious way. Now there's pressure on them to kowtow to the government. Now there's pressure on them also to enlist in something they know to be wrong, and which until recently Catholics were not allowed to do, to sign up with this organization that is controlled not by Rome, not by the Catholic Church, but by the Communist Party. And it's very, very distressing. There's another kind of weird analogy you could draw with Christians in the United States and in the West, in the sense that there are kind of 2 types of Christians. There's one type that is accepted by the mainstream media, that is accepted by progressive pundits as, enlightened. You carry a rosary in your pocket, but you don't protest abortion. You don't stand up against transgender and puberty blockers for children, all these things. That kind of Christian, that kind of Catholic is welcome, patted on the back, great religion, no problem at all by the powers that be. It's only the ones who stand true to the church and to all the moral teaching of the church that are unacceptable. There are those, and that's in a way also, I think, burning incense to Caesar.
Yeah. It's scandalous to so many of the lay faithful how we sit back and see. I mean, where's the statements from His Holiness on the continued persecution in Nigeria or in the Middle East, Pakistan? How many Christians there have been accused of blasphemy and have been imprisoned or martyred, executed? Or what about those Coptics on the beach? It's like in some ways you kind of wish and long for the days where His Holiness might call for a holy crusade. They might call for the Christian nations to come together in defense of persecuted Christians. But who is left to call on? There is no one to call on. And even if he did call, they wouldn't probably come. Do you see that as a part of the world we're living in and getting worse? Because that's your tagline. Things are getting worse on your book, The Coming Persecution, which, by the way, Sophia Institute Press, sophiainstitute.com. We're going to be linking to the book in particular on our show notes today. But do you see that? Like there's no ability to really solve this problem from a geopolitical side of the equation, it seems to me, that only the Holy Father and a holy crusade with all of our spiritual tools could really put a dent in this. Do you think?
Well, I think to do that, we need the will and the backbone to recognize that there's a battle going on. We can't simply make nice, I'm okay, you're okay, we all want the same thing. Our Holy Father has said on several occasions that Islam wants the exact same things that Christian wants. We all want peace. We don't want war. We don't want violence. And yet we know that there is a good swath of Islam that actually does not want that. They want holy jihad, and they believe that it's the will of Allah for them to persecute and slay non-believers. And this is something that they justify not despite their religion, but because of their religion. They can appeal to the writings of Muhammad. They can appeal to the Quran. At least certain texts of it. And so I think we just need to call a spade a spade. We need to be more honest. Right now, I think our failure to do that, to call things out and to say these are not the same. You don't see Christians going out and killing people and cutting people's heads off and saying, praise be Jesus Christ. You don't have that the way you have Islamists saying Allahu Akbar as they are killing Christians. And that distinction is real, and it has to be brought to the fore.
What about comparisons? What if we compare to, say, the 1st or 2nd century, the time of Ignatius of Antioch, who famously, had a conversation with Trajan himself before he was condemned to die by the lions in Rome? What about comparing our time to that time? I know that the last century was incredibly bloody with all of our wars between Nazism, communism, and the like. There was tremendous bloodshed on a scale the history, I think, of the world had never seen before. But what about the martyrs? Are we living in a time where we can compare that? Are we worse? Are we better off? What would you say?
Well, I think in terms of absolute numbers, there's no question. But the population, obviously, of the world population, the Christian population, is immense compared to what it was in the first couple of centuries. But Pope John Paul II said very famously just prior to the year 2000, he said, we're coming up, this is a real time of greater martyrdom than the church has ever known. He really believed that we were entering a new age of the martyrs. And this is something that I think is simply proven and borne out day by day. This is something that we see it. We see it everywhere. And the different drivers of Christian persecution, as diverse as they are happening simultaneously all around the world. And the historic will to defend Christians and defend religious liberty and to stand firm with Christians is waning. We don't see that in the West. The post-Christian West is now part of the persecuting problem rather than part of the defending solution. So yeah, things are they're very, very bad. And I see no signs that they're getting any better in the short run anyway, and probably in the midterm.
We've got it pretty we're made in the shade here. We're living the easy life. I mean, we might not like it when someone shouts at us or dislikes our opinions on social media. I personally was shouted at by a angry pro-abortion woman just last week at the Albany Men's March. But that's the worst of it, right? Like for the most part, most of us aren't going to be martyred here. But do you see that changing? Are we seeing a time? Do you anticipate a day and a time in our not so distant future or we might see the same kind of bloodshed that France is experiencing right now, actually, and other countries. Will we see that more here in the United States?
Well, I think that there is a historic trend that one discovers just looking through, as you mentioned, from the very first centuries, but all through ages of great persecution, and of Christians and of others, by the way. You can see this also in the case of the Jews under Nazi Germany, where a group is first ostracized, secondly demonized, as part of the problem, a problem to be solved. So much so that if you do something to put them down, you're actually benefiting your nation and your people. And I think that we're really dangerously close to that point right now, where Christians are called bigots, Christians are called haters, Christians are looked upon as part of the problem, not the solution.
Dr. Thomas Williams, I appreciate your insight and great book, The Coming Christian Persecution, Sophia Institute Press. SophiaInstitute.com is their website. You should check this out. We're going to be linking to it in our show notes over at thestationofthecross.com/ACT. Thomas Williams, God bless you. God love you. We appreciate you being on the show today.
God bless you too. Thank you, Joe.
Coming up after the break, we have more breaking news and stories. Then, of course, Father Robert Nixon to talk about the Imitation of Christ. It's all coming up next. Praise be to Jesus Christ. Welcome back to A Catholic Take. We had some technical glitches there, but we're back. Praise be to God. It all worked out. Let me just share this one story from the news. If I don't share any other one, this one's the most important today. CNA reports Nigerian priest returning from pastoral duties was shot dead. In a statement, Archbishop Augustine Akubizi expressed great shock following the death of Father Charles Agichi, who was shot dead upon returning from pastoral duties in Nigeria's Benin City last Wednesday, June 7th. The Nigerian Archbishop also appealed for prayers for the happy repose of the soul of Agichi, who was ordained a priest less than 1 year ago on August the 13th, 2022, and was serving as the vice principal of St. Michael College at the time of his death. There was other stories, like, for instance, Tucker Carlson surpassing 100 million views on his Twitter feed. Kind of upsetting, Fox News. They sent a cease and desist letter. That's a good time. And then apparently that whistleblower on the Burisma, scandal between the Hunter Biden and Joe Biden. Well, apparently he's got 17 audio recordings of all their phone calls, 2 of which go with Joe Biden himself. So good times, good times. Those are your headline news. Can I give a special shout out to our 300 Club members over on iCatholic Radio? Hey, God bless you all. Joining us every single morning, like Joe from the Boston area. I met him at the Albany Men's Conference. So good to meet and hang out with him, get to talk to him. But listens almost every day on iCatholic Radio. Maybe you're listening on the podcast feed. However you listen, we love the fact that you're here, a part of the Station of the Cross family. So thank you for doing that. Be sure to download the iCatholic Radio app in your mobile app store, iOS and Android. Listen to Catholic Radio 24/7, clear as crystal. Get the podcast of this show and all of our programs right in your mobile app, as well as the live video feed and so many other features. Be a part of the 300 Club on A Catholic Take every day by downloading the iCatholic Radio app. We put links to everything on our website, including the app. Just go to thestationofthecross.com/ACT. Joining us right now, though, is Father Robert Nixon. Good morning to you, Father.
Good morning to you, Joe.
Praise be to God. I'm grateful for your time today. I was watching your podcast series over on Tan Books on YouTube, but you can go to tanbooks.com as well. There's a whole series here on the spiritual masters, in particular talking about Thomas à Kempis and the Imitation of Christ. Now, Father, I got to tell you, about I guess it was about 12 years ago or so, I was hired to narrate the Imitation of Christ in audio book form. And to this day, I still get a royalty check for my effort. I wasn't that great, to be honest with you. And it was probably the most painful thing I had ever done. Not reading. No, it was just the Imitation of Christ was so difficult because you have to read it like 10 times when you're narrating in an audiobook form. And it was so heavy and it was so big. And I have never narrated another audiobook after that. So, and to see you talk about this in ways that I wish I had access to this kind of information when I was doing that project so many years ago. So let's start by talking about Thomas à Kempis. Who was Thomas à Kempis? I've heard some people say that he was a fictional person. They made him up, that he wasn't real. But in fact, he's a real living and breathing person. He is actually responsible for the Imitation of Christ and many other works, was he not?
Indeed. He was definitely a real person. He was born in 1380, I should say, and born of a kind of fairly lower class family. His dad was a blacksmith, and his mum was a village school teacher. But he showed particular talent, particular intelligence, and he was kind of took that as a sign that he was called to the scholarly life. And his first step, though, wasn't to become a priest. He firstly joined an organization called the Brotherhood of Common Life. And this was almost like a kind of lay Catholic association. Yeah. And he really enjoyed that community life. It was kind of like attending a Catholic college. And then he decided after this to enter a kind of monastic community, which his older brother had already entered. And he went into this community and devoted his life to giving people spiritual advice, to copying books. That was a great passion of his, and also to writing his own original books, and the best known of which is The Imitation of Christ. But he wrote a multitude of other works, which largely remain unknown to this day.
Now, is he blessed? I mean, is he on his way to be canonized someday? Does he really have a cause?
You know, this is an interesting question, because he is referred to as blessed. He does have an official feast day, if you look up the Acta Sanctorum, which is like the comprehensive account. But as far as the movement to make him a fully canonized saint, that seems to have gone by the wayside. And I think that'd be a good justification for pushing for that again, and particularly instituting him as a doctor of the church, because a doctor of the church is someone who has taught a lot of people in the faith, and certainly through his writings, he's been a wonderful teacher of the faith. But no, at the moment, there doesn't seem to be a big push for his canonization, and I guess that would. I'm not sure exactly why that is.
Now in the podcast, you discussed a story that he might have been buried alive. Is this true? Is this a legend? Is this just a story, or was there any fact here where he might have been buried alive?
So the story is, people used to ask, why isn't Thomas à Kempis a saint? And the answer which was given was, there was a suspicion that he might have been buried alive and then rolled over in his grave. Because if a person is buried alive, you don't know whether they die in a state of grace or not. But it seems to me that this story is actually a legend, because in the very early accounts of Thomas à Kempis and the writings shortly after his life, there's no mention of this story. And this story only seems to gain currency in about the 19th century. So I am inclined to suspect that it is not really a very solidly based story.
Okay, well, that kind of is very interesting, because if it was sort of made up, I wonder who made it up and what their motivation was to sort of spread a story that would cast doubt upon Thomas à Kempis.
I think the reason was people kept asking, why isn't he a saint? And, someone had to come up with an answer. But the reality is that when The Imitation of Christ came out, it was an anonymous work. And until quite recently, no one's been really sure that it has been the work of Thomas à Kempis. In fact, when readings from it appear in the current Roman breviary, it doesn't give an author. It just says, from The Imitation of Christ. So there were another number of other contenders, because he didn't put his name to the work out of humility. And of course, a person is not normally made a saint just because they've written a fantastic book, So, it is. I think he should be made a saint, but of course, at the time after his death, there wasn't the, the push for it.
I've also heard, and I've repeated it myself, so I hope it's true because I guess I've never really fact-checked it, that the Imitation of Christ is the second most popular spiritual work in the history of the world. Like other than the Bible, Imitation of Christ has sold more copies. I mean, if that's true, that blows my mind. Even if it was third or fourth, that would blow my mind. We're talking The Interior Castle, Confessions, Dark Night of the Souls. I mean, there's so many incredible spiritual classics. Is it really at number 2?
You know, it was traditionally been regarded as the second biggest selling book of all time after the Bible, and it exists in over, in thousands and thousands of different editions of it. Wow. Now, as to whether today it's still the second best-selling book of all time, I'm not sure. You know, I think probably maybe Harry Potter or whatever might be up there, but certainly in terms of spiritual influence after the Bible, this is one of the very most influential spiritual writings. Of course, as a Benedictine monk, I would say the Rule of Benedict would also rank pretty high in terms of influence because of the millions of Benedictine monks. But the Imitation of Christ is such a wonderful classic, and it's enjoyed by people, interestingly, across all Christian denominations. You know, it's very popular also with readers who are not, you know, in full communion with the Catholic Church of different. So it is a wonderful book, and I think really speaks to the heart, which is what makes it so universal. It's written from this wonderful insight into the human condition, and when you read it, I think every reader just has to recognize that what he says is true. Mm-hmm. You know, what his comments about life, about the human condition, about our own fallen human nature, and about our great need for God is so true. It's just so perpetually resounding.
We're going to get into a network break here in just one moment, and then I want to get into the actual work itself on the next segment. But before we hit the break, you also talked about in the podcast, Thomas à Kempis did he have an apparition or a vision of Our Lady? And what was the nature of that?
Yeah. He did indeed. So according to one of the very early lives of him, he had this great devotion to the Blessed Virgin. But after he entered religious life, it kind of started to cool down a little bit, and I guess he was busy and had distractions. So his devotion kind of, you know, lowered a little bit in intensity. And he had this vision of the Blessed Virgin, and she was going around to all the members of the community of Augustinian canons, as he was, and blessing them all. And she didn't bless him, and he was very upset. And he asked, "Why haven't you blessed me?" And she said, "It's because you've been a bit slack in your devotions." Oof. And after that, you know, he really picked it up. He embraced it wholeheartedly again. And I think probably for a lot of us, we have that experience of sometimes becoming a bit slack in our devotions and needing to be reawakened or re-energized.
Oh, yeah. Boy, that'd be a hammer blow, wouldn't it? When the Queen of Heaven comes to bless everybody but you. That'd be rough. Hold that thought. Father Robert Nixon is our guest. We're talking about the spiritual classic here of Imitation of Christ. It's a podcast series on Tan's YouTube channel, Tan Books on YouTube. We're going to put a link to it, the whole series, so you can see it for yourself at thestationofthecross.com/ACT. But coming up after the break, I want to get into the work itself. Who was this meant for? Was this meant for religious? Was it meant for the laity? Everybody? I don't know. We're going to find out with Father Robert Nixon coming up right after this quick break. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. Share us with a friend.
Hear what listeners are saying about the free iCatholic Radio mobile app.
Through the iCatholic Radio app, I have listened to the sermons and teachings several times. The effect has been a deeper understanding of my faith and Catholic tradition. This app has truly been a blessing in my life and has increased my faith.
Listen live or at your convenience to your favorite shows. Just search for iCatholic Radio in your app store today.
Praise be to Jesus Christ. Welcome back to A Catholic Take, a bold synthesis of information and inspiration. I'm your host, Joe McClain. So good to be on with you. We're having a conversation about Thomas à Kempis, The Imitation of Christ. This is a podcast series put out by Tan Books over on their YouTube channel, Tan Books. You can find it. We're going to link to the whole series for you so you can see it in our show notes at thestationofthecross.com/ACT. But at the top of the hour, we'll say goodbye to the radio audience. We're going to stay on for a half hour of the after show. Producer Jake and myself, we're going to hang out and talk to you directly. Whatever you want to talk about, that's your choice. You get to drive that conversation. And if you fail to do so, we'll simply bring up something from the 1980s to conversate about. So your choice, but your comments drive that in the com box. And you can find all of that on the website at thestationofthecross.com/ACT. Father Robert Nixon is our guest. Welcome back to the show, Father. Really fascinating to look at Thomas à Kempis in a way I'd never had before. But let's talk about the work itself, Imitation of Christ. Who was this written for?
Now, this is a very interesting question, and I think it accounts for the great popularity of the book. So it was written for a very general audience of Catholic readers. Now, before the time of Thomas à Kempis, pretty much every spiritual writing had been written basically for monks or nuns or priests, whereas at the time of Thomas, he kind of expanded his potential readership. And this was a time when there was a great reawakening of spirituality amongst the laity, an interest in devotion and contemplation. And so I think he doesn't say exactly who it's written for, but it's clear from certain parts that it's written not just for monks and for nuns, but for people who are engaged in business, in works in the world, even people who are in family life. So it is written literally for every single Catholic. So of course it's very relevant for priests and nuns and monks, but it's also relevant for people who are engaged in the business of the world.
I mean, when I went through it, it really felt like a sledgehammer. I mean, it was really difficult. Some parts were very difficult to get through. And I think a lot of people who read The Imitation of Christ, especially non-Catholics, I would argue, who I've shared it with, feel like it's too heavy, it's too harsh, it's too rigid, it's too difficult. Yeah. Was he responding to a time? Was Thomas à Kempis responding to a time of great apathy within religious life?
Yeah, he was. And you know, when modern read this, sometimes his parts about humility and so forth can strike a modern reader as, you know, is this going to damage self-esteem, or is this going to depress people or whatever? But he lived in a different era. He lived in an era when, low self-esteem didn't seem to be a problem or an issue at all amongst people. So he was kind of writing, for people in a slightly different psychological environment. He was also writing in a situation in which people were tending to be, I guess, we live in a situation where people kind of delude themselves with an optimistic attitude about the world, their own, life and character and everything. And so we always say everything is fine. And so when we read this book, it can sometimes strike us as a bit shocking to think, as he so eloquently describes the trials and the failings of our human nature, which I think these days we don't want to face up to. But he faces up to them very directly. And I think this is what people find to be a bit challenging, or to think, is this kind of too heavy? Is this going to be like depressing or bringing me down or whatever? But no, it's not going to do that if you read it in the right attitude, if you read it as something which is very honest, and take on what it says with courage and with faith.
Is there anything in the work itself that you felt was like stands out? Like it is like it's the pinnacle, it's the cream of the crop. I mean, what was the best part of Imitation of Christ from your perspective?
Yeah, one of the very best parts, I think, is is actually to be found in the very beginning of the book. His contemplations or meditations upon the vanity of the life of this world. And this was something which was, a common theme amongst a lot of writers and philosophers and so forth. But he expresses it so powerfully. And, it's like bringing together the thinking of, St. Paul and St. John and so forth, St. Augustine, but also Seneca and Marcus Aurelius. So he gives us this kind of brand of Christian Stoicism, which I believe is very much needed at this time.
So what's the big takeaway then? When someone goes through this book, and it's, okay, let me ask this question first. How big is The Imitation of Christ? I remember I went through it. It felt like it was never going to end. I'm going to be honest with you. It felt like it was never going to end.
In fact,
but how big is the work itself?
It's actually it's a really short book. I have a small edition of it, which is so small I can fit it into my pocket. And I don't know what the word count is, but it's probably something like 30,000 words or something. So it's shorter than a short novel. And it can sometimes seem long because it's so intense, because you read each paragraph and you have to really think about it, That's the thing, but it's not actually all that long. And, I think the takeaway from this is for everyone who hasn't read the book, read it. Even if you're not a Catholic, and I mean, it's probably Catholics who are listening to this show, but even if you're not a Catholic, read it, because it's such an important part of our Western culture, of Western Christendom. The second most influential book after the Bible, and you need to read it. And you can read it, and it's a kind of book you can read, and it might not appeal to you, but then 10 years later, something in it will come back to you and you want to read it again. Yeah. So it's a life-changing experience.
I'll have to read it now from a reader's perspective. Before I was reading it because I was narrating it and trying to get the essence of what Thomas à Kempis was trying to say and the way he was trying to say it. And I just found it very, very arduous. So I'm going to have another take at this. But let's talk about the podcast directly here. So how many episodes in this series? What is it you're trying to really communicate? It seems like you guys... You went into such depth on who he was as a person, which I really found utterly fascinating. But then you talked about the work, some of the stuff we've been doing today, but then you go beyond that. You got St. Bonaventure here. There's so much more here in the whole series. But your part, as far as what you participated in, was it just Thomas Aquinas or Thomas à Kempis rather, or was it more?
I've done this series of podcasts on The Imitation of Christ by Thomas à Kempis, and also had conversations about works from Bonaventure and so forth, which I've translated for TAN. And I've got another series of podcasts coming out in the near future on another classic spiritual book by D. Coussard, which is called Abandonment to Divine Providence, which is another absolute classic. And, what I do in these works is to open them up for the modern reader, So some things, if you just read it cold, it can be confusing, or it's like reading Shakespeare without notes to it. You need an explanation to know what's going on, to put it into context. And that's very much what I'm trying to do in these podcasts.
Wow, I'm going to have to come back then to talk about abandonment to divine providence. I like Trustful Surrender to Divine Providence. It's one of my favorite spiritual works that I usually read during the Lenten season every year, St. Columbine. So we'll have to have you back and maybe we can talk about that. But check this out, this podcast series from TAN Books on YouTube. Thomas à Kempis, Imitation of Christ. I'm going to have to reread this now. I feel like the gauntlet has been laid down. I have to read it. Father Robert Nixon, God bless you. Appreciate your insight and enjoyed the conversation today. God bless you. God love you, Father. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Coming up, we're going to have the after show on the live video feed. You can find it over at thestationofthecross.com/ACT. You can find the live video feed there, links to the YouTube and everywhere else. We'll see you there. God bless you and God love you.